The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the small-town park where children laughed and played. J.J. Bryant raced across the grass, his sneakers kicking up tufts of dirt as he chased a wayward soccer ball. His friends shouted encouragement, their voices blending into the cheerful hum of the park. J.J. grinned as he scooped up the ball, his joy contagious. At 10 years old, he was the kind of kid who made friends easily, bright-eyed, quick-witted, and endlessly curious. But today, curiosity would lead him into trouble. Near the edge of the park, J.J. spotted an abandoned bike leaning against a bench. The handlebars were scuffed, and the tires were flat, but something about it caught his attention. He jogged over, inspecting the faded blue frame and rusted chain. "What ya looking at, J.J.?" one of his friends called. "It's just a bike," J.J. replied. "Looks old, but it's kinda cool." As he crouched down to get a better look, the sound of a car door slamming made him jump. Brad Jenkins had been with the department for over a decade, his reputation tarnished by whispers of misconduct. To some, he was a no-nonsense officer who didn't tolerate troublemakers. To others, he was a ticking time bomb. He stopped a few feet away from J.J., his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp. J.J. blinked up at him, confused. "Just looking at this bike." "Don't touch it," Jenkins snapped, taking a step closer. "That's not yours." J.J. raised his hands defensively. "I wasn't gonna take it, sir. I just thought it looked." "Did I ask for your opinion?" Jenkins cut him off, his tone dripping with hostility. A small crowd began to gather, parents and children watching the interaction with growing unease. J.J.'s friends stood frozen, their faces pale. J.J. tried to explain, his voice trembling. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. Honest." Jenkins' patience snapped. "Don't talk back to me," he barked. Without warning, he pulled out his pepper spray and aimed it directly at J.J.'s face. The scream that tore from J.J.'s throat was primal, a mixture of pain and terror. He dropped to the ground, clawing at his face as the burning chemicals seared his eyes and skin. Mothers rushed forward, shielding their children from the scene, while others shouted at Jenkins. "Are you out of your mind?" one woman yelled. Jenkins raised his hands defensively, his voice unsteady. He was resisting. He wasn't following orders. "Orders? He's a child," another parent shouted, pulling out her phone to record the aftermath. Paramedics arrived within minutes, pushing through the crowd to tend to J.J. His sobs echoed through the park as they flushed his eyes with water, his small body trembling from the shock. In the chaos, no one noticed the moment Jenkins' face turned pale. A fellow officer whispered something in his ear, and he glanced toward the ambulance where J.J. lay. "Sheriff Bryant's kid," the officer muttered. Jenkins' heart sank. Sheriff Malcolm Bryant arrived at the hospital less than 30 minutes after the incident, his heart pounding with equal parts fear and rage. He'd received the call from one of his deputies, a frantic, stammering explanation about an incident involving J.J. and Officer Jenkins. That was all he needed to hear. As he strode into the emergency room, he was greeted by chaos. Nurses rushed between patients, while a cluster of townsfolk loitered in the waiting area, their murmurs hushed but insistent. Malcolm didn't stop until he found Leah, J.J.'s mother, standing outside a treatment room. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. "Where is he?" Malcolm demanded, his voice sharp but laced with worry. Leah gestured toward the door. "They're flushing his eyes. He's so scared, Malcolm. He keeps asking for us." Malcolm pushed through the door, his chest tightening at the sight before him. J.J. lay on the hospital bed, his small body curled up in pain. His eyes were red and swollen, tears streaming down his cheeks as a nurse gently dabbed at his face. "Daddy!" J.J. cried, reaching out blindly. Malcolm was at his side in an instant, gathering his son into his arms. "I'm here, buddy. I'm here." JJ sobbed into his father's chest. "It hurts so bad, Daddy. I didn't do anything wrong." Malcolm's jaw clenched as he kissed the top of JJ's head. "I know, son. I know. You didn't deserve this." Back at the station, Officer Jenkins sat in the briefing room, his hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee. His leg bounced nervously under the table as he replayed the incident in his mind, searching for a way to justify his actions. The door swung open, and Malcolm walked in, his expression thunderous. Every officer in the station knew better than to get in the sheriff's way when he looked like that. Jenkins shot to his feet, his lips parting to speak, but Malcolm cut him off. "Sit down." Jenkins obeyed, his hands trembling as Malcolm loomed over him. "What the hell were you thinking, Bradley?" Malcolm demanded, his voice low and furious. Jenkins fumbled for words. "Sheriff, I didn't know it was your kid. I thought—" "You thought what?" Malcolm snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "That a 10-year-old boy looking at a damn bike was a threat? That he needed to be pepper-sprayed?" Jenkins stammered, his face pale. He wasn't following orders. He was mouthing off. "I acted within protocol." "Protocol?" Malcolm's voice rose, his anger barely contained. "Do you honestly think protocol justifies attacking a child?" "My child? I didn't know, Sheriff." Jenkins protested, his tone defensive. "That's not an excuse," Malcolm growled. "You didn't know, and you didn't care. You acted out of bias, not out of duty. And now my son is lying in a hospital bed because of you." Jenkins sat in stunned silence, his confidence crumbling under the weight of Malcolm's fury. Word of the incident spread through the town like wildfire. By the next morning, the local news stations were running the story, and footage from a bystander's phone was circulating online. The grainy video showed Jenkins yelling at JJ before pulling out the pepper spray. The cries of the gathered parents echoed over the clip, painting a damning picture of Jenkins' actions. Protests erupted outside the sheriff's department, with residents holding signs that read "Justice for JJ" and "No racists in uniform." Community leaders called for Jenkins' immediate dismissal, and Malcolm found himself caught in the crossfire. Inside the department, tensions were high. Some officers resented the scrutiny, grumbling about the media's portrayal of Jenkins. Others sided with Malcolm, recognizing the severity of what had happened. "Sheriff," Deputy Taylor said hesitantly as he approached Malcolm's office, "the union's already involved. They're trying to frame this as a misunderstanding. They're saying Jenkins acted appropriately given the circumstances." Malcolm's head snapped up. "Appropriately? A child was pepper-sprayed, Taylor. There's nothing appropriate about that." Taylor nodded. "I know. But they're digging in. Jenkins is lawyered up, and they're ready to fight any disciplinary action." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his temples throbbing. He had always prided himself on running a department that served the community fairly and honorably. But now, the very foundation of that trust was crumbling under his feet. Chapter 7. A Father's Decision. That evening, Malcolm sat at JJ's bedside, watching his son sleep. Leah sat across the room, her eyes red from crying. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. Malcolm sighed, running a hand over his face. "I'm going to fire him." Leah nodded, but her expression remained grim. "And then what?" "You know the union won't let it end there. They'll protect him. They always do." "Then I'll fight them," Malcolm said firmly. "I'll take it to the board, to the courts if I have to. This department won't stand for officers who think they can act like this without consequence." Leah's gaze softened. "You're doing the right thing, Malcolm. But you're not just the sheriff, you're JJ's dad. Don't lose sight of that." "I won't," Malcolm promised. "This fight isn't just for JJ. It's for every kid in this town who deserves to feel safe." As he held his son's hand, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just seeking justice, he was seeking change. The protests outside the sheriff's department swelled over the next several days. What had started as a handful of concerned parents had grown into hundreds of residents demanding justice for JJ. People carried signs that read "No justice, no peace," and "Protect all children, not just some." News vans parked along the street, and reporters shoved microphones at anyone willing to speak. One local activist, Monique Daniels, quickly became a leader of the movement. "This isn't just about one child," Monique said into a microphone during a rally. "This is about a system that allows officers like Jenkins to patrol our streets with unchecked bias. It's about the countless black and brown kids who are seen as threats instead of children. Sheriff Bryant has a choice to make: stand with the community or protect the system." Inside the station, Malcolm watched the rally on a muted TV. Deputy Taylor stood behind him, arms crossed. "She's got a point," Taylor admitted. "I know she does," Malcolm replied, his eyes never leaving the screen. "But this is bigger than Jenkins. If we don't handle this right, the whole department's credibility goes up in flames." Taylor hesitated. "Sheriff, with all due respect, it's already on fire." Malcolm sighed. He knew Taylor was right. Meanwhile, Officer Jenkins had retreated into the protective embrace of the police union, which immediately issued a statement defending him. Officer Jenkins acted in accordance with his training and protocol when faced with a potentially volatile situation, the statement read. "The portrayal of his actions as racially motivated is unfounded and unfair." Jenkins, however, was not as composed. He sat in the office of his union-appointed attorney, his hands clasped tightly together. "You've got to spin this right," the attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Victor Hanley, said. "You panicked. You feared for your safety. You didn't see a child. You saw a potential threat. That's the story." Jenkins nodded but remained silent. He could feel the walls closing in around him, the weight of public outrage threatening to crush him. "They want to crucify me," Jenkins finally muttered. "All because of a kid who didn't listen." Hanley smirked. "That kid's father is the sheriff, and the media loves a scandal. But don't worry. We'll handle this." The following morning, Malcolm held a press conference. Standing at a podium outside the department, he faced a sea of cameras and microphones. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "As sheriff of this county, and as a father, I want to address the recent incident involving my son, J.J. Bryant, and Officer Bradley Jenkins." The crowd fell silent, waiting. What happened to J.J. was unacceptable. It was a failure of judgment, a misuse of power, and a betrayal of the trust this department owes to every citizen. Malcolm's voice grew firmer. Effective immediately, Officer Jenkins has been placed on administrative leave pending the results of an internal investigation. And I want to assure this community, we will hold him accountable for his actions. Reporters shouted questions, but Malcolm raised a hand. "I know this decision won't satisfy everyone. Some will say I acted too harshly. Others will say I didn't act fast enough. But I want to be clear. There is no place in this department for officers who cannot exercise restraint, especially when dealing with our most vulnerable, our children." The crowd erupted into cheers, though not everyone was satisfied. Across social media, conservative pundits accused Malcolm of throwing Jenkins under the bus to save his reputation, while others praised his leadership as a necessary step toward reform. The town itself became a microcosm of the national divide. In coffee shops and diners, residents debated the incident, their voices heated and passionate. "He's a good cop," one man argued over his morning coffee. "Jenkins just made a mistake. It's not like the kid got shot." "A mistake?" another woman shot back. "That good cop pepper-sprayed a 10-year-old for no reason. If JJ weren't the sheriff's son, they'd be burying this right now." The tension seeped into every corner of the community, from schools to workplaces. JJ's classmates whispered about him in the hallways, while their parents argued about the incident at PTA meetings. For Malcolm, the strain was overwhelming. He fielded calls from concerned citizens, angry deputies, and politicians eager to weigh in. Through it all, he tried to focus on JJ, who was struggling in his own way. JJ had returned home from the hospital, but he wasn't the same. The once outgoing boy who loved soccer and bike rides now refused to leave the house. He flinched at loud noises and avoided windows, terrified that Jenkins, or someone like him, would come back. One night, Malcolm found JJ sitting on the floor of his room, staring at the door. "What's wrong, buddy?" Malcolm asked, kneeling beside him. JJ looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "What if he comes back, Daddy? What if he hurts me again?" Malcolm's heart broke. He pulled JJ into a hug, holding him tightly. "He's not coming back. I promise you. And if anyone ever tries to hurt you again, they'll have to get through me first." JJ nodded but didn't look convinced. The next morning, Malcolm made a decision. He called a therapist who specialized in trauma and set up an appointment for JJ. It was a small step, but one he hoped would help his son begin to heal. As the internal investigation continued, Deputy Taylor uncovered a troubling pattern in Jenkins' record. "Sheriff," Taylor said, placing a stack of files on Malcolm's desk. "You need to see this." Malcolm opened the files, his anger growing with each page. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct were scattered throughout Jenkins' history, many of them dismissed or ignored. "How the hell did this go unchecked?" Malcolm muttered, his hands tightening into fists. Taylor shrugged grimly. "The system protects its own. And Jenkins is good at covering his tracks. But not this time." Malcolm nodded. "Send this to the DA. If Jenkins thinks he's walking away from this, he's got another thing coming." The new evidence against Officer Jenkins added fuel to the fire. As word of his troubling history spread, the community's anger deepened. Malcolm released a statement outlining the findings, promising not only a full investigation but also sweeping reforms within the department. "This isn't just about one officer," Malcolm said during a press conference. "It's about ensuring that every officer in this department upholds the values of fairness, restraint, and respect. The trust of this community is not a given, it's earned." The statement was met with mixed reactions. Supporters applauded Malcolm's transparency, while critics accused him of vilifying law enforcement to appease the public. The trial of Officer Jenkins was a spectacle from the start. Media from across the country descended on the small town, turning it into a flashpoint for debates about police accountability and systemic bias. In court, Jenkins' attorney, Victor Hanley, argued that his client had acted within the bounds of his training. "This was a split-second decision," Hanley told the jury during his opening statement. "Officer Jenkins had no way of knowing the child's intentions. He acted to ensure his safety and the safety of others." The prosecution, led by District Attorney Elena Morales, painted a starkly different picture. "Bradley Jenkins didn't act out of fear, he acted out of bias," Morales said. "This was not a case of split-second judgment. It was a gross misuse of power against a vulnerable child who posed no threat." One of the most emotional moments of the trial came when JJ was called to testify. Sitting in the witness chair, his feet barely touching the ground, he clutched a stuffed bear his therapist had given him for comfort. "Can you tell us what happened that day, JJ?" Morales asked gently. JJ nodded, his voice shaky but clear. "I was looking at a bike. It wasn't mine, but I wasn't going to take it. Then the officer came over and started yelling at me. I got scared." "What did you do next?" "I tried to tell him I wasn't doing anything wrong," JJ said, tears brimming in his eyes. "But he didn't listen. He just sprayed me. It hurt so much. I couldn't see or breathe. I thought I was gonna die." The courtroom was silent, the weight of JJ's words hanging heavy in the air. "Thank you, JJ," Morales said, her voice filled with empathy. "You were very brave to share that." The prosecution's case was bolstered by the release of Jenkins' body cam footage. The video showed the interaction in stark detail. JJ's calm and respectful tone, Jenkins' escalating aggression, and the moment Jenkins pepper-sprayed the boy despite his compliance. The footage sparked outrage in the courtroom and beyond. Activists and legal analysts called it a damning indictment of Jenkins' behavior, while the defense struggled to explain it away. Hanley argued that the video didn't capture Jenkins' perspective, insisting that the officer's actions were rooted in perceived danger. But the jury's grim expressions suggested the footage had left a lasting impression. When Malcolm took the stand, his dual roles as sheriff and father were on full display. "Sheriff Bryant," Morales began, "how did you feel when you learned that your son had been assaulted by a member of your own department?" Malcolm hesitated, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I felt betrayed. Not just as a father, but as a leader. My job is to ensure this department serves and protects everyone in this community. Jenkins' actions were a failure of that duty. Do you believe bias played a role in what happened?" "Yes," Malcolm said firmly. "If JJ hadn't been a black boy in a park that day, I don't believe he would have been treated the same way." Hanley's cross-examination tried to paint Malcolm as biased against Jenkins, suggesting his personal connection to the case clouded his judgment. "My judgment isn't clouded," Malcolm replied. "It's clear as day. Jenkins abused his power, and that's something I can't and won't tolerate." After 2 weeks of emotional testimony, closing arguments, and hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. Guilty on all counts. Jenkins was convicted of assault and misconduct in office, his sentencing set for a later date. The courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and tears, with JJ's family embracing each other tightly. Outside, protesters celebrated the verdict as a victory for justice. But Malcolm knew the work was far from over. In the weeks following the trial, Malcolm implemented sweeping reforms in the department. Officers underwent mandatory bias training, a citizen oversight board was established, and complaints of misconduct were reviewed with newfound rigor. JJ continued his therapy, slowly regaining his confidence and sense of safety. One day, as he and Malcolm walked through the park, JJ stopped and pointed to a group of kids playing soccer. "Can I go join them?" he asked. Malcolm smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Of course, buddy." As JJ ran off, his laughter filling the air, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road to justice was long and difficult, but moments like this made it worth every step. Years later, the town was a different place. Justice in Uniform, a program inspired by JJ's story, became a model for police reform nationwide. JJ, now a confident young man, often spoke to communities about his experience, advocating for empathy and accountability. Malcolm, though grayer and slower, continued to lead with integrity, knowing that his fight for justice had made a lasting impact, not just for his family, but for generations to come.